And once again, I want to say greetings to each and every one of you, Aquaba, and welcome. Welcome to another round of the Conscious Raster Report here on LIB Radio, LIB TV here on livinginblack.com. My name is Kidi Owadu, aka the Conscious Raster. Weekday mornings, you and I get together here live. We commit you from 9 a.m. Pacific time. That's 12 noon Eastern time, 5 p.m. GMT, and 8 p.m. East Africa time. We get together with you. And we deal with culture, consciousness, historical perspectives, entertainment, economics, education, health, labor, law, politics, religion, family, conflict, future studies, all areas of human interactivity and development. Today's date is Tuesday. It is the 27th day of January, 2026 in the Western Gregorian calendar. This corresponds to the year 6266 in the Kemetic calendar, to which we have realigned our cultural clock. Welcome to the 7th millennium. You have found your family in a peaceful place here on LIB Radio, LIB TV, here on livinginblack.com. And here's what we have for today's program. I hope you find it to be interesting. I hope you find it to be fascinating. And I hope you are very much compelled to tune in with us today, all day. Well, at least for our morning show. You know, we broadcast all day long on younow.com, as well as we, LIB Radio, we broadcast all day long on the TuneIn app. So if you're on the go and you can't be on your computer, check the TuneIn app. It goes where you go. You can put it up on your phone, and you can get a lot of great stations on the TuneIn app. I like to use the TuneIn app myself, not only to monitor LIB Radio, but also to hear some of my favorite programs, like The Carl Nelson Show on WOL AM radio. Here's what we have on store for you today. I hope you find it to be a fascinating, absolutely fascinating topic and subject. Let me find where I have the introduction, the conscious roots, growth, heritage, and the biology of being, part 3. This is our third installment, reading directly to you from the text of my new book. And some people say, well, why do you do that? You're giving it away. Well, I'm not giving things away. I'm sharing. There's a big difference between giving things away and sharing. And I find that when I share with good people, I mean really good, genuine people, my audience, our audience, that our audience has a wonderful habit of reciprocating, of wanting to share back. And you know something? That's a good thing. So here we are today. Let me just close this out and see who is in the house. Who wants to say hello to your brother bright and early in the morning? I'm double checking over here. I have the Facebook video feed is up, and I have to clean things up on my desktop. It's a little wild on my desktop today. As much as I do the best I can to put everything in place for every show, my desktop gets kind of wild right before going on the air. But hey, we're just doing the best we can to do the best we can with what the Creator has blessed us with. And so as a consequence of all of that, I am now ready to go with you. One more button and let's go. Today we're talking about the new book, The Conscious Roots, Growth, Heritage, and the Biology of Being. And I hope you find this to be a fascinating, absolutely fascinating subject. And here is what we have. I'm going to put, before we go into the book, I've been working with Notebook LM for about a month now, and I really, really like what it does for me. Yes, it is put out by Google, and no, I am not a fan of Google, and others have said the same thing as well. Google makes great apps and tools and instruments and software and all of that, but Google is an agent. I must emphasize that point. It is an agent of the opposing forces, the forces that oppose our liberation, our freedom. Google has been an agent since the Obama administration, so we admit that, and let's move forward. using Notebook LM. I'm going to put this up on the table. And this is a graphic I put together, a slide show. This is in Adobe Acrobat. So Google and Adobe are working together on this, right? But let me just take you through this and let's see what it has to show, what it has to say about the new book and the research that's in it. This is the conscious root, growth, heritage, and the biology of being, refining the sentient ecosystem nature. Sentient, the thinking, breathing, living, acting ecosystem, which is our 37 trillion cells all working together for our body. Our body is not a machine. It is a temple that is composed of an ecosystem. And there is this narrative I'm going to share with you. A tree that forgets its roots will bear no fruit. This is an ancient parable. The thesis, meaning true growth, requires converging ancient wisdom, indigenous philosophy, with modern science, epigenetics, and quantum biology. This shift from man as machine to man as sentient ecosystem. That's a very important point. The body is not a machine. It is a cellular civilization. The old narrative, the body is a machine, body is a collection of parts, disease is malfunction of those parts, and that this fixed mechanics is a solution. But we are taking you through a paradigm shift in this new book. The refined narrative, the body is an ecosystem. Microbial symbiosis. You are a colony. We are more plural than singular. And that's an important point. The body has 37 trillion cells all working in symbiosis with each other. Health is coherence between these cells. And livity, the Rasta term, livity, stands for vital energy flow. Let's go forward. The soil in which the tree sinks its roots. The remediation of history and the echoes of origin. We began the book. We don't begin the book. We look deep into the Nile Valley medical mystery. From the Nile Valley, they performed the first brain surgeries, calculated solar years, centuries before Europe. The great Zimbabwe, architectural genius, unrivaled for a long time, massive, mortarless stone architecture, earthquake resistant. And we now are transitioning this through Heru, the spiritual sign of Horus, the son of Osar and Aset, or Heru. And then we also talk about our heritage, what is in the soil, our roots. Our roots are embedded in the Mali Empire. It was an intellectual hub. The University of Timbuktu housed over 25,000 students and vast libraries. Key insights we learned from there: knowing your gold, crown yourself. Historical identity acts as a psychological immune system. Let's go forward. The roots, epigenetics, and the biology of being. The old narrative, DNA is a fixed instruction manual, and it deals with the science of inheritance. Trauma can be and is transferred. Post-traumatic slave syndrome can be inherited, but it also can be disinherited. The epigenetic markers be the bridge between these and the refined narrative. From the new book, The Refined Narrative, DNA is a responsive text edited by our experiences. The science of inheritance, resilience transfer, healing, the lineage vinage requires a biological text for future generations. This lineage, this healing that we're doing, we are doing this for future generations. The sap, cultivating the inner garden, the inner ecosystem. We carry roughly as many microbial cells as human cells. The vagus nerve, very important in all of this. The second brain, the gut produces the majority of the body's serotonin. 86% of the serotonin that makes us feel good begins in the microbiome. And then tending the temple, diversity in our diet, diversity in our microbiome. The practice fermentation, the whole foods reduce static in the system. And just a couple more panels here. This is really good, but I'm going to truncate this because we're going to read from the book. The Trunk, The Lion Mentality and the Psychology of Heritage. The old narrative, the colonial mind. We are prey, we are colonized, and we are shameful in that state. But the refined narrative, the lion consciousness. We regain our sovereignty and our dignity as we put on our crown. We crown ourselves. Dignity as biology. Shame is inflammatory. That's the old narrative. Pride is restorative. Sovereignty is the refusal to internalize oppression from others. And the vicarious resilience, drawing strength from the survival of our ancestors. We draw strength from the survival of our ancestors. The branches, alignment with the rhythms of the earth. The branches of this tree. Again, the conscious roots signifies the tree. That's the main theme of the book. Now we have new habits. We awake and we utilize the morning light, the morning sun, to awaken our cortisol, the stimulant. And that now brings us into harmony with our circadian rhythms, with the rhythms of the year and the rhythms of the day. But at night, a lot of us are disrupted by the blue light from artificial screens, from artificial intelligence, things artificial we are moving away from. The master, the protocol, the master clock, the pineal, the suprachiasmatic nucleus must align with the sun. Morning, view bright sunlight to set your clock. I go out and I run every morning, 10 minutes for 5 months of the year. And then once it warms up, I run for 20 minutes. Evening, embrace the darkness. That's a very key point of the book. The cool blue. Embrace the darkness. The red, the amber light to protect our melatonin, to protect our pineal glands. The disruption, artificial blue screen and blue screens and LED screens disrupt our natural circadian rhythms. We're almost there. The leaves, food as information. Living foods, nutrigenomics. Food is not just fuel. It is information that talks to your genes. What did I just say? Food is information that talks to your genes. That's one of the most important lessons I have to convey. And I do hope that you hear it, you understand it, and you internalize this so that you and I and we can all move forward. Ital living. Eat the rainbow. Plants produce compounds for defense. We consume this intelligence. And we now can understand the difference between information and non-information, between that which is in harmony with our human biology, our human nature, and that which creates chaos. We have become so addicted to the stress hormones associated with chaos that we can't wait to hear what the fool has said yesterday. You know what I'm talking about. No, we're going to move away from that and start looking for the peace, the benevolence, the magnificent, the points where we can meditate on the positive, sovereign, sustainable. The warning, processed food strips away the molecular conversation. Again, we say our food speaks to our genes. Eat the rainbow. We consume this intelligence. And so that takes us through this PowerPoint, or not as PowerPoint, it's a Acrobat. It will be Acrobat that I put up for today. I hope you find it to be highly, highly useful and informative. Now, let's get into the book. I have the book all ready to go here. It's up on my screen. Let's put up that window. We're going to go into the book. And the book is entitled, once again, Conscious Roots, Growth, Heritage, and the Biology of Being. We're going to go into today chapter 6 of the book, and we're going to read kind of as comfortably, quickly as we possibly can. And we're going to see if we can get through the entire book in 2 more sessions. The Psychology of Heritage, chapter 6. And I began each chapter with a quote. You know that. Today we use Dr. Joy DeGruy's quote, from her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, PTSS, is a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. From Dr. Joy DeGruy. A wound that doesn't bleed. There is a particular kind of suffering that leaves no visible mark, cannot be bandaged or sutured, that eludes x-rays and blood tests, yet causes devastation as profound as any injury. It is the wound of disconnection, the severing of a people from their roots, the stripping away of cultural identity, the systematic erasure of heritage until individuals stand unmoored, floating in a present that makes no sense because the past has been stolen. This is the wound that colonization inflicted and its aftermath perpetuates. This is the injury that manifests as depression, anxiety, addiction, and the rage in communities that have been taught to be ashamed of their origins. This is the violence that occurs when people are told generation after generation that they come from nothing, that their ancestors were primitive, that their culture is inferior, that their very existence is a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be celebrated. One second, let me turn the page here. Come on, buttons, you can work. Here we go. Psychology has a name for this now. Historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, cultural bereavement. But our ancestors knew it long before Western psychology gave it a label. They understood that to cut a tree from its roots is to kill it, that to separate a people from their heritage is to wound them in ways that touch every aspect of being. The Rastafari symbol of the lion, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, the Negus, the embodiment of strength, dignity, and royal heritage, represents the antidote to this wound. It is not merely a symbol, but a psychological anchor. When we reconnect with our ancestry, when we claim our heritage with pride, when we stand in the dignity of knowing who we are and where we come from, we become lions rather than prey, rulers rather than subjects, whole rather than fragmented. This is not metaphysical abstraction. This is measurable, observable psychology. Identity shapes mental health as surely as nutrition shapes physical health. Heritage is not ornamental, but foundational. To heal the wound that doesn't bleed, we must understand how deeply our sense of self depends on knowing our story. We talk about the architecture of identity, how we become ourselves. The self as story. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We do not merely experience events, we construct narratives around these events, stories that explain who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. What our lives mean. These stories form the architecture of identity, the framework upon which we build our sense of self. Developmental psychology reveals that children as young as 2 begin constructing autobiographical narratives, organizing their experiences into coherent stories. By adolescence, the ability to tell a complex, nuanced, personal narrative predicts psychological well-being, resilience, and successful identity formation. The personal narrative exists within cultural narrative. We tell our individual stories using the vocabulary, the themes, the archetypical patterns provided by our cultural heritage. Who am I is inseparable from who are my people. My personal story makes sense only within the larger story of the community, the lineage, the culture I belong to. When that larger story is missing, distorted, or filled with shame, the foundation crumbles. How do you build a healthy identity when the cultural narrative available to you says your people were slaves and nothing more, that your ancestors contributed nothing to civilization, that your culture is primitive or pathological? This is the psychological devastation of cultural erasure. It is not simply that historical knowledge is missing, it is that the very ground upon which identity is built has been poisoned, filled with toxic narratives designed to produce internalized oppression, self-hatred, and despair. Cultural identity as protective factor. Research in community psychology consistently demonstrates that strong cultural functions as a protective factor against mental health problems. Young people with deep knowledge of their heritage, pride in their ethnic background, and connection to cultural traditions show point A, lower rates of depression and anxiety, B, higher self-esteem and self-efficacy, point, greater resilience in the face of discrimination, stronger sense of purpose and meaning, better academic outcomes, lower rates of substance abuse, and more positive future orientation. This is not correlation, but causation, verified through longitudinal studies that track individuals over time. Cultural pride doesn't simply correlate with better outcomes, it produces them, creating psychological resources that buffer against adversity. The mechanism is clear. When you know your people have survived and thrived despite enormous challenges, when you understand your ancestors' achievements, when you feel connected to something larger and older than yourself, you develop a different relationship to present struggles. Obstacles become temporary rather than permanent, surmountable rather than insurmountable. You inherit not just DNA, but determination, not just genes, but grit. Conversely, cultural disconnection and shame predict vulnerability. Young people who have been taught to be ashamed of their heritage, who know nothing of their ancestors' achievements, who see their culture only through the distorted lens of dominant narratives, these young people are more vulnerable to every form of psychological distress. Next, we're moving into the lion mentality. Dignity as birthright. Let's talk about the symbol of the lion and its meaning. The lion in Rastafari symbolism is not chosen randomly. It represents specific qualities, qualities that directly counter the psychological damage of colonization and its aftermath. The lion is, number one, dignified. The lion moves with natural authority, commanding respect without aggression, powerful without cruelty. This dignity is inherent, not earned, not granted by others, but emanates from within. The lion is courageous. The lion does not flee from challenge. It stands firm, faces threats directly, and protects its pride. This courage comes not from lack of fear, but from the strength that makes fear manageable. The lion is sovereign. The lion bows to no one. It is king of its domain, ruler of its territory, subject to no external authority but the laws of nature and divine order. The lion is protective. The lion defends its community. Its strength serves not selfish ends, but collective well-being. Power is wielded in service of others. And the lion is patient. The lion does not chase every opportunity, but responds to every provocation. It conserves energy, strikes with purpose, and moves with calculated intention. These are not merely admirable traits, but psychological necessities for people who have been systematically told that they are inferior, that they have been trained to bow to unjust authority, who've been taught to be ashamed of their strength and to doubt their own worth. The lion mentality is a deliberate cultivation of these qualities, not as pretense or performance, but as reclamation of something that belongs to us by right of ancestry. Dignity is standing in your truth. Colonization sought to destroy African dignity through every means necessary, every means possible. Enslaved Africans were stripped naked on auction blocks. Families were torn apart. People were given demeaning names. Their languages and religions were forbidden. Their bodies were exploited and their humanity was systematically denied. The psychological legacy of this assault on dignity persists. It manifests as internalized racism, the unconscious acceptance of inferiority, the constant seeking of validation from external authorities, and the inability to recognize one's own worth. Cultivating dignity means unlearning these patterns. It means recognizing that your worth is not determined by others' opinions, not granted by institutions or systems, and not dependent on achievement or performance. You are valuable because you exist, because you carry within you the DNA of survivors, the heritage of builders, the blood of those who endured the Middle Passage and colonization and enslavement, and still stood up, still fought back, still created beauty and community and culture. This dignity shows up in how you carry yourself, literally in posture and bearing, but also in how you engage with the world. When you know your worth, when you do not tolerate disrespect or exploitation, you do not shrink to make others comfortable. You do not apologize for existing. You stand in your full height, claiming space you have every right to occupy. Psychologically, this shift from shame to dignity is transformative. Shame produces cortisol. It keeps the body in stress response, impairs cognitive function, and undermines immune health. Meanwhile, dignity, genuine self-worth rooted in accurate understanding of heritage, produces the opposite. Calm confidence, regulated nervous system, clear thinking, and robust health. Courage, facing the lion's share. The courage of the lion is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to act despite fear, to face threats directly rather than fleeing or freezing. For people dealing with the psychological aftermath of colonization, this courage is essential. It takes courage to claim your heritage when the dominant culture tells you it's shameful. It takes courage to educate yourself about African history when schools have taught you to dismiss it. It takes courage to stand in your worth when systems are designed to make you feel worthless. It takes courage to resist, to speak truth, to refuse to comply with your own oppression. This courage is not innate. It must be cultivated. And one of the most powerful ways to cultivate it is through connection to ancestry. When you learn about ancestors who resisted enslavement, who maintained cultural practices under the threat of death, who organize rebellions, who preserve languages and stories despite prohibition, who build communities from nothing, you inherit their courage. You realize if they could face what they faced and still stand, I can face what I am facing. If they could maintain dignity while being treated as property, I can maintain dignity while facing discrimination. If they could envision and work toward freedom when freedom seemed impossible, I can envision and work toward the world I want to see. Ancestral connection provides what psychologists call, quote, vicarious resilience, unquote, the strengthening that comes for witnessing or learning about others' resilience. But when those others are your ancestors, the effect is more powerful. Their resilience becomes your inheritance. Their courage becomes available to you. Sovereignty means bowing to no Babylon. The lion's sovereignty, its refusal to bow, its natural authority, representing psychological autonomy, the capacity to think for oneself, to resist manipulation, to maintain integrity despite external pressure. Colonization and its systems, what Rastafari calls Babylon, depend on psychological subjugation, on people accepting illegitimate authority, on internalized oppression that makes external control unnecessary because people police themselves. Cultural sovereignty means recognizing that systems claiming authority over you may have no legitimate right to that authority. It means questioning rather than automatically accepting, resisting rather than complying when compliance serves injustice, and thinking critically rather than absorbing propaganda. This is not antisocial defiance or narcissistic grandiosity. It is healthy autonomy, the psychological capacity to maintain your own values and judgment even when pressured to abandon them. It is what the psychologist Eric Fromm called, quote, positive freedom. Freedom not just from external constraint, but for authentic self-expression and ethical action. People with strong cultural identity and pride develop this sovereignty more easily. When you know your ancestors created sophisticated civilizations, you don't automatically assume European or Western ways are superior. When you understand that your cultural traditions encode wisdom developed over millennia, you don't dismiss them as primitive. When you recognize that systems of oppression have consistently lied about your heritage, you become skeptical of other narratives those systems provide. The psychological sovereignty is dangerous to unjust systems, which is precisely why colonization worked so hard to destroy it, and why reclaiming it through cultural pride is an act of resistance. Heritage as healing, the therapeutic power of knowing. Narrative repair. One of the most powerful therapeutic inventions in psychology is narrative therapy, helping people rewrite the stories they tell about themselves and their lives, shifting from narratives of victimhood and helplessness to narratives of survival and agency. For people of African descent, especially descendants of enslaved Africans, the dominant cultural narrative is toxic. Your ancestors were slaves, defined entirely by their oppression, victims without agency, people who contributed nothing to their own liberation or to civilization. This narrative is not just false, it's psychologically devastating. It positions you as descended from helpless victims, carrying forward only trauma and deficit. It provides no models of strength, no heritage of achievement, no grounds for pride. Reclaiming African history, accurate African history performs narrative repair on a massive scale. It replaces the narrative of victimhood with a narrative of resilience, the story of deficit with a story of contribution, a tale of primitiveness with the truth of sophistication. Your ancestors were not just slaves. They were survivors of the most brutal system of exploitation in human history. They were not just victims. They resisted in countless ways, from subtle sabotage to armed rebellion, from preserving African culture to creating entirely new cultures that blended African roots with new world realities. They were not primitive. They descended from people who built pyramids and universities, who developed mathematics and medicine, who created art and philosophy, and governance systems of remarkable sophistication. When you know this, your entire self-narrative shifts. You are no longer defined by oppression, but by resistance to oppression. No longer marked by what was done to your ancestors, but by what they survived and created despite it. No longer carrying a deficit, but carrying a wealth of African heritage. This shift is measurable. Studies of African American youth who undergo cultural education programs, learning African and African American history, engaging with African cultural practices, connecting with Africa and diaspora communities, show significant improvements in self-esteem, academic performance, future orientation, and mental health. The healing power of pride. Pride, a genuine pride based on accurate knowledge, not arrogance or superiority, is therapeutic. It counters shame, which is toxic to psychological health. It provides psychological resources to cope with discrimination and adversity. It creates a positive rather than negative self-concept, which influences everything from relationship choices to career aspirations to health behaviors. The cultivation of cultural pride was central to the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s. Black is beautiful was not a mere slogan, but a psychological intervention, an attempt to counter centuries of messaging that black skin, African features, and African heritage were ugly, inferior, and shameful. The impact was profound and measurable. That generation, raised with, quote, "Black is beautiful," with African cultural centers with curriculum that included African history, showed better psychological outcomes than previous generations despite facing continued racism and discrimination. Pride functioned as armor, not protecting them from racism, but protecting them from internalizing it. The Rastafari emphasis on African heritage and identity performs the same function. When you claim your identity as African, when you honor the motherland, when you study the history and embrace the culture, you are not engaging in empty symbolism. You are performing psychological healing work, repairing the damage of cultural erasure, reclaiming what was stolen. Collective healing through shared heritage. Individual healing occurs within collective healing. When communities come together around shared heritage, when cultural practices are maintained and passed forward, when the elders share knowledge with youth, when stories are told and histories are remembered, this creates healing spaces, containers for processing collective trauma while building collective strength. This is why cultural institutions matter. Community centers, cultural festivals, African-centered schools, museums, and artistic expressions. These are not luxuries or add-ons, but essential infrastructure for psychological health. Spaces where cultural identity can be affirmed, where heritage can be learned, and where belonging can be felt. The African principle of Ubuntu, I am because we are, recognizes that individual identity and health are inseparable from community. You cannot heal alone what was broken collectively. You cannot reclaim your heritage in isolation from others who share that heritage. This is the power of community in Rastafari tradition. The reasoning sessions, the communal living, the shared practices and beliefs. Identity is strengthened through collective affirmation, through being surrounded by others who know and honor the same truths, who carry the same heritage, who are engaged in the same work of reclamation and resistance. From prey to predator, the psychological shift, the colonial mind versus the liberated mind. Colonization created what some scholars call, quote, the colonial mind, unquote, a psychological state characterized by internalized oppression, acceptance of inferiority, imitation of the colonizer, the rejection of one's own culture, and inability to imagine alternatives to the systems that oppress you. The colonial mind sees through the colonizer's eyes, values what the colonizer values, accepts the colonizer's narratives about past and present, and polices itself according to the colonizer's standards. This is the most insidious achievement of colonization, making people complicit in their own oppression, making external control unnecessary because internal control has been established. The lion mentality represents the opposite, the liberated mind, characterized by pride in inheritance, rejection of imposed inferiority, capacity to think independently, ability to maintain cultural values against external pressure, and imagination capable of envisioning and working toward liberation. The shift from colonial mind to liberated mind is not automatic or easy. It requires conscious work, sustained effort, willingness to question everything you have been taught, courage to stand apart from dominant narratives, and connect to alternative sources to truth, primarily the history and culture that colonization tried to erase. The practical cultivation of lion consciousness. How does one actually cultivate this lion mentality? The shift from prey consciousness to predator consciousness, from shame to dignity, from fear to courage. Point 1, study your history. This is not optional. You cannot build pride on ignorance. Read African history, African American history, Caribbean history. Whatever connects to your particular heritage, learn about the achievements, the resistance, the survival, the brilliance. Let this knowledge become part of your self-concept. Connect with cultural practices, whether through music, food, language, dress, spiritual traditions, or art. Engage with the cultural practices of your heritage. These are not superficial markers, but embodied wisdom, ways of being in the world that connect you to generations of ancestors. Surround yourself with affirming community. Seek out people who honor African heritage, who are engaged in the work of cultural reclamation, who reinforce rather than undermine your growing pride and consciousness. Distance yourself from people and environments that require you to be ashamed or small. Challenge internalized racism. Notice when you catch yourself thinking or speaking in ways that reflect internalized oppression, when you automatically assume European is better, when you judge African features or cultures negatively, When you police yourself according to white standards, question these thoughts. Replace them with truth. Claim your space, physically, socially, economically. Practice taking up the space you have every right to occupy. Stand tall. Speak clearly. Assert your needs and boundaries. Refuse to shrink or apologize for merely existing. Honor your ancestors. Create practices of remembering, whether through prayer, meditation, ritual, or simply speaking their names and honoring their struggles and gifts through libation. Let their strength become available to you. Contribute to collective liberation. Growing strength not for personal benefits, but in service of community, in resistance to injustice and building alternatives to oppressive systems. The lion protects the pride. The biology of psychological transformation. This is not just psychological, but biological. When you shift from shame to pride, fear to courage, from subjugation to sovereignty, your entire physiology changes. Chronic shame and fear keep you in sympathetic nervous system activation, the stress response. Cortisol remains elevated. Inflammation increases. Immune function is suppressed. The brain's fear centers remain hyperactive, while executive function is impaired. Pride, dignity, and courage activate different systems. The parasympathetic nervous system can engage, allowing rest and restoration. Cortisol normalizes. Inflammation decreases. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, decision-making, and self-regulation, functions optimally. Even your gene expression changes. Studies of people who shift from states of threat and shame to states of pride and purpose show measurable changes in which genes are turned on or off. Genes involved in inflammation are downregulated. Genes supporting immune function, cellular repair, and neuroplasticity are upregulated. This is epigenetics in action. Environment and experience rewriting biology. When you change your psychological relationship to your heritage, you change your body at the cellular level. When you stand as a lion rather than crouching as prey, you literally become different biologically. And here's the profound implication. You can pass this forward. The epigenetic changes that come from pride, courage, and dignity can be inherited by your children. You can give them a different biological starting point, can equip them with nervous systems that are more regulated, immune systems that are stronger, brains that are more resilient. This is how we heal intergenerational trauma, not just psychologically, but biologically, by interrupting the transmission of stress markers and transmitting markers of resilience instead. The roar that echoes forward. The lion's roar can be heard for 5 miles, announcing presence, claiming territory, warning challengers, calling to the pride. When we stand in our heritage with pride, when we cultivate the lion mentality of dignity and courage, when we refuse to bow to illegitimate authority, we are roaring. That roar echoes forward, reaching young people who need to hear it, reaching communities that need to remember their strength, reaching across generations to tell our descendants, you come from lions, not prey, from builders, not beggars, from kings and queens, not subjects. This is the psychology of heritage, not abstract theory, but practical power, not historical curiosity, but present necessity, not individual concern, but collective imperative. Our mental health, our capacity to resist, our ability to envision and build the future we want, all depend on knowing who we are, on standing in that knowledge with pride, on living from that place of dignity and strength. The wound that doesn't bleed can only be healed by reconnecting what was severed, by reclaiming what was stolen, by standing in truth of ancestry and refusing to be diminished by lies about inferiority. We are descendants of the first humans, carriers of the oldest heritage, children of the continent that birthed civilization itself. We are lions. We have always been lions. The question is only whether we will remember, whether we stand in that truth, whether we will roar. The ancestors are watching. The children are listening. The future awaits our answer. Will we bow or will we stand? Will we whisper or will we roar? Will we accept the colonial narrative of shame or will we claim our heritage of dignity? The choice is ours. The power is ours. The heritage is ours. It always has been. Now we must simply remember. We're going to keep going forward. And this book, I hope you find this to be inspiring. Conscious Roots, Heritage, Growth, Heritage, and the Biology of Being. We're in the chapter talking about our heritage. Chapter 7, Breaking the Mental Chains. This quote from Dr. Naim Akbar from his book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. He wrote, when young black boys learn that there are no limits to the possibilities on the basketball courts, we create the athletic genius of Michael Jordan or Magic Johnson. When our young people know that there are no limits to their potential in the world of manufacturing, communication, physics, chemistry, or the science of the human mind, then those same young black minds will recreate these fields of human endeavor with the same incomparability. Naim Akbar. The change you cannot see. The most effective change are those that captive cannot see, cannot feel, cannot recognize as change at all. Physical shackles can be broken, removed, escaped. But mental chains, beliefs about yourself and your people that have been installed so deeply, so early, so thoroughly that they feel like truth rather than programming. These are the chains that persist long after physical bondage ends. The chains that make external control unnecessary because internal control has been perfected. This is the masterpiece of oppression, to make the oppressed complicit in their own subjugation, to install within their minds the very narratives that justify their exploitation, to teach them to police themselves according to standards designed to keep them subordinate. When you believe you are inferior, when you have internalized the oppressor's assessment of your worth, when you unconsciously accept narratives that diminish your people and elevate your oppressors, you have been colonized not just politically or economically, but psychologically in the deepest and most devastating way. The Rastafari call this, quote, mental slavery, unquote. The bondage that persists in the mind even after physical chains are removed. Bob Marley sang, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. This is not poetic exaggeration, but a precise diagnosis of the central problem facing oppressed peoples. The internalization of oppression, the acceptance of inferiority, the mental chains that must be broken before any other liberation becomes possible. Breaking these chains requires recognizing them first, understanding how they were forged, how they are maintained, how they operate, with your own within your own consciousness. Only then can the work of cognition liberation begin, cognitive liberation. The deliberate process of identifying, challenging, and replacing toxic narratives with truth. The architecture of mental colonization. How propaganda becomes truth. Propaganda does not work through single exposures or obvious lies. It works through repetition, through consistency across multiple sources, beginning early in childhood before critical thinking develops, through presenting itself not as opinion, but as neutral fact, and through associating certain ideas with authority, legitimacy, and social acceptance. The propaganda that installed narratives of African inferiority and European superiority did not announce itself as propaganda. It presented itself as science, as history, as common sense, as the natural order of things. It appeared in textbooks and encyclopedias, in museums and universities, in newspapers and literature, in religious teachings and legal codes, in casual conversations and children's stories. This is how lies become truth in the minds of those who hear them, through sustained repetition from sources coded as authoritative, beginning in childhood, and reinforced throughout life, presented not as debatable opinion, but as established fact. Consider the narratives about Africa that most people, including many Africans and people of African descent, absorbed through their education. Africa as the, quote, dark continent, as primitive and uncivilized, as a place where nothing of significance happened until Europeans arrived to, quote, discover and, quote, civilize it. Africa as disease and poverty and tribalism, never as the birthplace of mathematics and medicine, never as home to great universities and sophisticated kingdoms, never as the origin of human civilization itself. These narratives were not accidental. They were deliberately constructed to justify colonization and enslavement. If Africans were primitive and inferior, then enslaving them or colonizing them would be framed as beneficial, as bringing civilization to savages, as the white man's burden rather than the white man's crime. The effectiveness of this propaganda is measured not by whether colonizers believed it, though many did, but by whether the colonized came to believe it, and they did. Generations of African children were educated in colonial schools designed explicitly to make them ashamed of their heritage, to see European culture as superior, as to aspire to whiteness while internalizing the impossibility of achieving it. The internalization process. Internalized oppression operates beneath conscious awareness. It shows up not as explicit beliefs you can examine and reject, but as automatic associations, unconscious biases, gut feelings that European is better, that lighter skin is more attractive, that straight hair is more professional, that African features are less beautiful, that African languages are less sophisticated, that African cultural practices are primitive or embarrassing. It appears in the choices you make without thinking, straightening natural hair, avoiding the sun to maintain lighter skin, speaking African American vernacular English only in private, while code switching to standard English in public, feeling embarrassed by African music or food or dress in the presence of white people, and preferring European names over African ones. It appears in your expectations and aspirations, assuming leadership and expertise will be white, feeling surprised when you encounter black excellence, doubting your own capabilities while assuming white people's competence, seeking validation from white approval while discounting praise from other blacks. Most insidiously, it operates in how you judge yourself and other black people, being harder on black failure than white failure, policing other black people's behavior according to white standards, feeling shame about aspects of black culture that don't conform to white norms, distancing yourself from other black people seems exceptional. Distancing yourself from other black people to seem exceptional. This is mental colonization in operation. The oppressor's voice inside your own head, speaking with your voice, using your mouth, guiding your choices, and shaping your self-concept according to standards designed to keep you subordinate. Let me turn the page 1 second here. Cognitive liberation, the work of unlearning. Recognition, seeing the change. The first step in breaking mental chains is to recognize their existence. This requires developing what critical theorists call consciousness, the ability to see systems of oppression not as natural or inevitable, but as constructed and maintained through specific mechanisms, including psychological ones. You must learn to notice when you are thinking thoughts that serve your oppression rather than your liberation. When you are applying double standards that favor whiteness, when you feel shame about aspects of your heritage that deserve pride, when you are seeking validation from sources that have never had your best interests at heart. This recognition is often painful. It means confronting the very ways you have been complicit in your own oppression, the ways that you have internalized and repeated the colonizer's narratives, the ways you have judged yourself and others according to standards designed to find you lacking. But this pain is necessary. You cannot remove change you don't acknowledge wearing. You cannot change patterns you don't recognize enacting. The work of consciousness raising, of learning to see what has been invisible, to question what seems natural, to reject what has felt like truth, is the essential foundation of liberation. The challenge is questioning the narratives. Once you recognize internalized narratives, you must actively challenge them. This means, and bear with me as I'm turning pages on doesn't want to cooperate. We're making it cooperate. Point 1, examining the source. Who taught you this belief? Was it someone with the authority to make such judgments? Did they have your best interests at heart? What did they have to gain? What did they have to gain from you believing this? Seeking counter evidence. If you believe African people are less intelligent, less capable, less beautiful, what evidence contradicts this? What African achievements have you been taught to ignore? What standards of beauty, intelligence, and capability are being used? And who created these standards? Recognizing historical context. How did these narratives serve colonization and slavery? How do they continue to serve systems of oppression today? Who benefits from you believing you are inferior? Applying consistent standards. If you judge a black person's actions harshly and judge a white person's identical actions in the same way, would you judge a white person's identical actions in the same way? If not, you are applying racist double standards, possibly internalized ones. This challenging process is ongoing, not a one-time event. Internalizing oppression runs deep, installed over decades. Internalized oppression runs deep, installed over decades, reinforced constantly. Rooting it out requires vigilance, requires catching yourself in the moment of internalized racist thinking and consciously choosing different thoughts. Replace, installing new narratives. Breaking mental change is not merely removing false beliefs, it's replacing them with truth. This requires actively studying African and African diasporic history, engaging with African cultural practices, surrounding yourself with images and narratives of Black excellence, and seeking out Black-centered spaces and communities. You must deliberately install new narratives, new automatic associations, new gut feelings. This happens through, number one, immersion in truth. Read African history voraciously. Study the achievements of pre-colonial civilizations. Learn about the resistance and creativity of enslaved Africans. Discover the contributions of Black people to every field of human endeavor. Point two, cultural engagement. Practice African cultural traditions, whether through food, music, language, dress, spiritual practices, or art. Let these practices reconnect you to heritage at the embodied level, not just intellectual. Point three, community affirmation. Surround yourself with people engaged in the same work of decolonizing consciousness, people who affirm your worth, who celebrate Blackness, who are building lives based on pride rather than shame. And point four, repetition and reinforcement. Just as propaganda works through repetition, so does counter-programming. You must repeatedly expose yourself to affirming messages, continually reminding yourself of historical truth, and consistently practice thinking and speaking in ways that will honor rather than diminish your heritage. The weapon of language, how language shapes thought. Words that free and words that bind. Language is never neutral. The words we use to shape how we think, what we notice, and what seems possible. Colonial powers understood this. This is why they forbade Africans from speaking their languages, why they imposed European languages on colonized people, and why they renamed places and names according to European conventions. Language carries ideology. When we speak of, quote, discovering America or Africa, we encode the idea that these places didn't truly exist until Europeans arrived to name them. When we describe African governance systems as, quote, tribal, while calling European ones parliamentary, we code the former as primitive and the latter as sophisticated through the structures, though the structures may be equally complex. The reclamation of language is therefore essential to cognitive liberation. This means rejecting degrading terminology. Words like primitive, tribal, savage, uncivilized. These encode colonial ideology. Replace them with accurate, natural descriptors. Reclaiming and redefining. Terms like Black and African were once used as slurs. Their reclamation and redefinition as sources of pride represent linguistic resistance. Choosing self-determination. Using names and terms that communities choose for themselves rather than those imposed by outsiders. Africa, not the dark continent. African traditional religions, not paganism or witchcraft. And precision over euphemism. Naming oppression clearly. Enslavement, not, quote, the peculiar institution. Colonization, not exploitation or exploration. Genocide, not settlement. Stolen land, not purchased territory. Language shapes consciousness. When you change your language, you begin to change your thinking. When enough people change their language collectively, you begin to change culture. Positive affirmation. Speaking liberation. The inverse of colonial language is liberating language. Words that affirm, that celebrate, that claim power and dignity. This is the power of affirmation. Speaking truth about yourself and your people until it becomes automatic, until it rewrites the programming installed by propaganda. Rastafari linguistic innovations demonstrate this principle. The use of, quote, I and I, unquote, instead of me and you, asserts fundamental unity and equality. Replacing, quote, understand, unquote, with overstand claims intellectual sovereignty. We don't stand under knowledge, but over it, mastering rather than being mastered by it. These are not mere wordplay, but cognitive tools, ways of using language to reshape consciousness, to resist internalized oppression through the very structure of speech. We talk about the long work of liberation. Mental change, breaking mental change, is not quick nor easy. The installation of internalized oppression took decades, involved thousands of repetitions, engaged powerful emotional and social mechanisms. Its removal requires sustained conscious effort over the years. There will be moments of backsliding, times when old patterns reassert themselves, situations where you catch yourself thinking in colonized ways. This is normal. The work is not to achieve perfection, but to maintain direction, to keep recognizing, challenging, and replacing, to grow progressively freer, even if never completely free of all internalized programming. The goal is not to eliminate all influence of dominant culture. That may be impossible while living within that culture, but to develop capacity for critical consciousness, to be able to notice when you are thinking thoughts that serve your oppression, to have tools for challenging and changing those thoughts. This liberation of consciousness is a prerequisite for all other liberation. You cannot effectively resist external oppression while internally accepting its premise. You cannot build new systems while your mind remains colonized by old ones. You cannot teach your children to stand tall while you remain mentally bowed. Breaking the chains, claiming the future. The mental chains are real, but they are not unbreakable. Millions have broken them before. Every person who moved from shame to pride, from internalized racism to cultural affirmation, from mental slavery to cognitive liberation, their success proves it is possible. Your ancestors survived the Middle Passage, enslavement, colonization, Jim Crow, and ongoing oppression with their dignity intact, with their humanity unbroken, with their resistance unquenched. You carry their strength. You can do this work. Breaking mental chains is not a betrayal of pragmatism or rejection of success. It's the only path to genuine success, the only route to building lives of authenticity and power, the only way to raise children who are psychologically free. The work begins with you, but extends beyond you, to your children, your community, your people. Every chain you break in your own consciousness weakens the system that forged it. Every narrative you replace with truth undermines the propaganda that maintains oppression. Every moment of critical consciousness is an act of resistance. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. The chains are waiting to be broken. The question is only whether you will take up the work. The ancestors are watching. The children are waiting. The future depends upon your answer. And that concludes the second section of the book. The second section of the book is, again, deals with reclaiming our heritage. The third section of the book, which I'm going to introduce right now before we move on, is really about putting on the crown, and it deals with the biology of being. We now begin to bring this back into our body, our control, and the tools we use to do this. Section 3, cultivating the crown, the spirit. Focus, mindfulness, wisdom, and higher thought. The body is a temple. The heritage is the foundation. But the crown, consciousness itself, is where divinity manifests in human form. This third dimension of being transcends mere survival or even cultural pride. It reaches towards the heights that our ancestors glimpsed when they built observatories to track celestial movements, when they developed philosophical systems to explain existence, when they entered meditative states that dissolved the boundaries between self and cosmos. The crown represents higher thought, the capacity for wisdom that goes beyond knowledge, the mindfulness that allows us to witness our own consciousness and choose our responses rather than being driven by unconscious patterns. This is the realm of the spirit, not separate from body or heritage, but their culmination. The flowering that becomes possible only when roots run deep and the trunk stands strong. In Rastafari symbolism, the crown acknowledges divinity within, a Godhead that each person carries, the spark of Jah that animates all living things. The halo speaks to enlightenment, to consciousness expanded beyond the confines of ego and conditioning. The book represents wisdom, but the accumulated knowledge of ancestors encoded in text and tradition, and the living wisdom that emerges when consciousness becomes still enough to hear truth speaking from within. To cultivate the crown is to engage in the ancient work of consciousness itself, the deliberate practice of becoming more aware, the more present, more aligned with truth that transcends the propaganda of Babylon, the limitations of trauma, and the smallness of fear. So that introduces us to the third section of the book. We're going to take a break for today, and we're going to come back tomorrow with chapter 8 of this book, The Art of Overstanding. And chapter 8 will begin with this quote from Muta Baruch of the Rastafarian does not seek to understand Babylon. He seeks to overstand it, to rise above it. And this other quote I begin the chapter 8 with, understanding is mental, but overstanding is spiritual. So that's where we are going to begin tomorrow. I hope you find this to be wonderful, useful information. I'm looking, I do see you in the house, Brother Eddie McCrory. Welcome, Aquaba. It's great to have you in the house today. Let me double check over here. Make sure my Rumble family gets acknowledged for Africa One. She says, Hotep, Brother Keaty, and Global LIB family, sorry for my lateness. Well, no, you are right on time. I hope you did get a chance to hear a lot of what we shared today. This I'm reading from the new book, the upcoming book, The Conscious Roots, Growth, Heritage, and the Biology of Being. We're going to go into the book again. I think we're going to do two more readings from the book. Tomorrow we're going to begin with chapter 9, chapter 8, I think it's chapter 9. Can't remember, was it chapter 8 or chapter 9? I got it still up on my desktop. Tomorrow we're going to begin with chapter 8, the art of overstanding. Here, let me just put a marker in this. Chapter 8, the art of overstanding. And that's a very, very critical concept that we will be dealing with tomorrow. And I'm going to just bookmark this so I will be able to come back to it tomorrow and know right where I am. And we'll pick it up from there. This book represents something that's truly transcendent for me. I had a lot of help writing the book because of the AI classes I've been teaching on the Thursdays. And to no small extent, this book represents a culmination of those studies. I do not apologize for having engaged in those studies because personally, I think my capability, my power has been upgraded to a very significant level at this point. And we're doing the best we can with what we are learning. That is why we learn. That's why we study. That's why we grow. That's why I have been very diligent with these studies. So tomorrow, Wednesday, we're going to pick it up one more time from the book. On Thursday, we're going to go right back into our studies in AI, the applications of AI. So on that note, thank you all for your participation, for being with us. And tell friends, have you told any friends in the past 24 hours to listen to LIB Radio? We're going to have to do better. We can do better. And we talk about all of these wonderful things that we do with and for ourselves. And we're going to do the best that we can do. And on that note, I want to thank you all for tuning in today to your favorite. We aim to be your favorite. We are LIB Radio, LIB TV. We are livinginblack.com. Tell your friends to tell their friends that we have our own now. And we can do what we will to do with what we have, with what is ours. It is our inheritance. It is our legacy. It is ours to build for because of our birthright as people of African ascent. I wish you all peace and prosperity. I'll be with you next time. Peace, y'all.